You know, I don't think I'm alone in saying my backlog is basically a graveyard of unfinished games that just lost my interest halfway through. It's a commitment thing, right? If a game doesn't hook me mechanically or respect my time, I'm out. That said, there are a sacred few that I stuck with until the credits rolled, and I enjoyed every second of the journey. We're talking about the 20 best games that actually held my attention and never let me down. Hi folks, welcome to CryptoMac, and let's dive straight into the list. So first up, we have Horizon Forbidden West, and I want to start here because I think this one actually captures something personal about what this list is really about, because when Zero Dawn came out, it hit me in a way I genuinely didn't expect, and that kind of experience creates a very specific kind of vulnerability going into a sequel, where part of you is already bracing for the moment it stops feeling as special. I mean, you know how it is. You love something, you wait years for the follow-up, and somewhere in that waiting, your imagination fills in gaps that no real game could ever perfectly meet. So the disappointment when it arrives slightly off from what you'd hoped isn't even really the developer's fault. It's just the math of anticipation. That said, Forbidden West did something I really appreciated. It didn't try to chase the feeling I had playing the first game. It just focused on being a richer, more complete experience in its own right, with combat that finally felt as dynamic as the world around it, exploration that kept rewarding curiosity both above and below the surface, and a story that trusted you to care about these characters without relying on the original's reveals to carry the emotional weight. It met me where I was rather than where I'd been, and honestly, for a sequel carrying that much expectation, that's not a small thing. It's exactly the kind of quiet, steady reliability that earns a spot on this list. Coming in next, if there is one game on this list that you absolutely need to play without looking up a single thing, it is definitely Outer Wilds. This is a space mystery that completely redefines what it means to explore a digital world. The sense of scale here is just massive. And even though the graphics lean into a more stylized art direction, the visual impact is absolutely staggering. I mean, seeing the way different planets interact and change in real time is something I haven't seen done this well since maybe Subnautica, right? It's all about that raw, unfiltered curiosity that drives you to see what's behind the next moon or inside a crumbling ruin. To be fair, it can be a little intimidating at first, but once the music kicks in, you're just totally hooked on the atmosphere. The soundtrack is hauntingly beautiful and perfectly captures that mix of wonder and slight existential dread that comes with space travel. You're not just following quest markers here, you're piecing together a story that spans across an entire solar system, and that story is something that is going to stay with you forever because of how deeply it connects to the mechanics of the game. It's so rare to find a game that respects your time and your brain this much without holding your hand through every single beat. The ending is quite literally one of the most profound things I have ever experienced in any medium, let alone a video game. Plus, the way the whole mystery unfolds feels so organic that you'll feel like a total genius when everything finally clicks into place. It's a bold, exceptional piece of game that proves you don't need a billion-dollar budget to create something life-changing. So please do yourself a favor and go into this one with zero spoilers so you can experience the magic for yourself. So next up, look, we all know that remaking one of the most beloved games of all time is a recipe for disaster, but somehow Final Fantasy VII Rebirth actually pulled it off. It takes that classic story and makes it feel brand new by dropping you into a massive world that actually feels worth exploring. I mean, usually these big open maps are just filler, but here, everything feels like it's building towards something meaningful for the characters, you know? The combat system is another huge win because it's actually deep and forces you to think about how your party members work together. It's not just about Cloud swinging a big sword, it's about timing your spells and using everyone's unique abilities to control the battlefield. Honestly, it's one of the few action RPGs where I actually wanted to engage with every single mechanic they threw at me. Anyway, the rearranged score is what really gets you because it hits all those nostalgia buttons and reminds you why you fell in love with this world in the first place. It's hauntingly beautiful at times and incredibly hype at others, which is exactly what a Final Fantasy game should be, right? To be fair, the game is absolutely huge, so you have to be ready to sink 100 hours into it if you want to see everything. Still, every minute feels justified because the quality of the writing and the world building is just so high across the board. It's a bold, exceptional piece of work that doesn't just coast on its famous name to get by. And, it's one of the best games that didn't let me down because it actually had the guts to change things up while keeping the heart of the original intact. If you were on the fence about whether this was just a cash grab, trust me, this is a real deal. It's a massive, beautiful journey that reminds us why Final Fantasy is still the king of the genre. Coming in next, if you want to see what your hardware is actually capable of, then you need to check out Alan Wake 2 because it is easily one of the most next-gen looking game on the list. The lighting and textures are so realistic, it's almost scary, which fits perfectly with the weird meta-horror trip the story takes you on. I mean, Remedy has always been known for their storytelling, but they really outdid themselves here by creating a narrative that breaks the fourth wall in such a clever way. It's a bold and exceptional project that feels like a fever dream you never want to wake up from. Honestly, to be fair, it gets pretty dark and intense, but the game knows exactly when to throw a curveball to keep the pacing perfect. And speaking of curveballs, that musical sequence is easily one of the coolest things I've ever played in any video game. I was literally shouting at my monitor because of how stylish and high energy the whole thing was. It's that kind of creative swing for the fences moment that you just don't see in other big budget titles these days. Plus, the way the game switches between the two protagonists keeps the gameplay feeling fresh and gives you different perspectives on the madness. You're constantly finding new layers to the mystery, and the payoff for your curiosity is always worth it. It's a masterclass in art and scale that proves horror can be more than just jump scares and dark hallways. This is one of the best games that didn't let me down, because it was even more ambitious than I hoped it would be. You really owe it to yourself to experience this one with the lights off and the volume turned way up. Coming in next, we have Portal 2. I feel like this one remains as a gold standard for puzzle design because it manages to integrate high-concept mechanics with a fire story that most genres would envy. You wouldn't think a game about placing holes on walls could have such emotional depth, but the writing is hilarious and deeply character-driven at the same time. The dynamic between the player and GLaDOS evolves in such a fascinating way, making the narrative feel much more personal than your average puzzler, right? I mean, the mechanics are truly mind-bending, introducing elements like light bridges and gels that completely shift how you perceive the space around you. It's an exceptional example of how to iterate on a successful formula by adding layers of complexity without making the experience feel cluttered. The dynamic between the player and GLaDOS evolves in such a fascinating way, making the narrative feel much more personal than your average puzzler, right? I mean, the mechanics are truly mind-bending, introducing elements like light bridges and gels that completely shift how you perceive the space around you. And, it's an exceptional example of how to iterate on a successful formula by adding layers of complexity without making the experience feel cluttered. That said, the environmental storytelling is where the game really shines, using the art and scale of Aperture's history to tell a silent, tragic tale. You're uncovering the remains of a corporate empire, and the way the music shifts to match the era of the facility you're in is just hauntingly beautiful. To be fair, the puzzles are the main draw, but the pacing of the jokes and the world building is what keeps you moving forward, It's a masterclass in game design because it perfectly balances difficulty with that satisfying light bulb moment of realization. Still, what everyone remembers most is the conclusion, which is easily one of the most creative and visually stunning endings in gaming history. And the ending song is a classic for a reason, perfectly capturing the wit and irony that defines the whole series. It's a project that shows what happens when every department at a studio is working at the absolute top of their game. This is one of the best games that didn't let me down because it proved that puzzle games could be high-budget, cinematic experiences. So next up, if you want to experience the absolute peak of squad-based RPGs, then Mass Effect 2 is the game you need to play right now. It's the ultimate building a team simulator where every single crew member has a compelling arc that pulls you into their world. I mean, the writing is so sharp that you'll find yourself agonizing over every conversation choice just to make sure your team is happy, The sci-fi vistas are absolutely epic, taking you from crumbling ruins to high-tech cities that look stunning even years later. Honestly, the sense of scale is just massive, making every mission feel like a crucial piece of a much larger puzzle. To be fair, the combat is a big step up from the first game, but the real draw is the deep connection you form with your squad, and it all leads up to the suicide mission, which is easily one of the best finales ever put into a video game. The stakes are incredibly high because anyone, and I mean anyone, can die if you aren't prepared for the worst. That said, successfully bringing everyone home alive is one of the most satisfying feelings you can get in gaming. Still, it's the quiet moments on the Normandy between missions that really make the game special for me. It's an exceptional project that proves how much better a game can be when you actually care about the people standing next to you. Plus, the voice acting is legendary, bringing every alien and human character to life with so much personality. This is easily one of the best games that didn't let me down because it delivered a space opera that felt truly personal. Coming in next, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is perhaps the most refined entry in From Software's storied catalog, moving away from RPG elements toward pure action. If you want the most satisfying parry system ever designed, this is the definitive answer, as it turns defense into an aggressive, rewarding playstyle. I mean, the clashing of steel isn't just a sound effect, it's a mechanical conversation between you and the enemy that requires perfect timing, right? The game is visually stunning, with an art and scale that proves Remedy isn't the only studio pushing the boundaries of what a game can look like. That said, the story is much more direct than other FromSoft titles, providing a nice change of pace that allows for more traditional character development. Following a single protagonist gives the narrative a focus that helps ground the more fantastical elements of the world, you know? Still, the game maintains the high level of difficulty that the studio is known for, though it feels more like a skill test than a gear check. It's an exceptional piece of work that demonstrates how a developer can reinvent themselves while keeping their core philosophy intact. Plus, the level design is brilliant, using verticality and stealth to give the player a sense of agency that feels fresh for the genre. To be fair, the lack of build variety might alienate some Souls veterans, but the mechanical depth of the swordplay more than makes up for it. It's a story that stays with you forever because it represents a triumph of design over convention. Next on the list, when comparing Bloodborne to Sekiro, it's important to clarify that while both are masterpieces, they occupy different levels of design philosophy. Bloodborne is a masterpiece in its own way, trading the precision of the parry for a visceral, proactive combat system that rewards raw aggression. I mean, the shift from a shield-based defense to the rally mechanic was a bold move that completely redefined the studio's approach to difficulty, right? The game is visually stunning, with a level of Gothic art and scale that remains a benchmark for the industry even years later. Honestly, the way the world loops back on itself with clever shortcuts is a masterclass in level design that few developers have managed to match. Still, the narrative depth is what truly sets it apart, offering a complex story that stays with you forever if you're willing to look for it. To be fair, it's far more cryptic than a direct story like Sekiro's, but that ambiguity is what gives the lore its lasting power, Plus, the trick weapons provide a mechanical variety that ensures no two hunters will have the exact same experience. Coming in next, we have BioShock. If you want a game that is going to absolutely blow your mind with its world and its story, then you need to play BioShock immediately. I mean, the setting of Rapture is easily one of the most visually stunning and iconic environments ever created for a video game, right? The sense of art and scale when you're walking through those leaking glass tunnels is just massive and incredibly immersive. Honestly, the writing is so fire that it makes most other shooters look like they're not even trying, You're using plasmids to rewrite your own DNA and taking on these terrifying big daddies in fights that feel like a total rush every time. To be fair, it's a dark and disturbing journey, but that's exactly what makes it so compelling and impossible to put down. Plus, the choices you make regarding the Little Sisters actually feel heavy and impactful, which was such a bold move for a game back then. Still, it's the mystery of who you are and why you're there that really keeps you hooked from the first minute to the last. It's an exceptional example of what happens when a developer has a massive vision and the guts to see it through to the end. And also, the atmosphere is just top tier with a soundtrack and sound design that make the city feel alive and dangerous around every corner. I'm pretty sure that you'll be thinking about the phrase, "Would you kindly," for the rest of your life once you finish this one. So next up, we have Persona 5 Royal. Look, I usually don't have the patience for 100-hour RPGs, but Persona 5 Royal is just on another level when it comes to keeping you hooked. This game is pure style, and I'm not just talking about the jazzy music or the flashy UI, though those are both incredible, right? It's the way the whole thing feels like a 100-hour vacation in a stylized Tokyo that actually makes you care about the world you're living in. The deep social sim elements are what really make it work, because by the end of the journey, those characters feel like your actual best friends. Anyway, the combat is snappy and fun, but the real fire moments are when the story hits those big emotional beats that you just don't see coming, you know? To be fair, the game is absolutely massive, but the royal updates fix a lot of the pacing issues from the original release. Still, the art and scale of the late-game palaces are just legendary and show off exactly why this team is so well respected. Plus, the music is so good that I still listen to the soundtrack while I'm working out or driving. It's just that catchy. It's an exceptional example of how to make a turn-based game feel like a high-octane action movie without losing any of the strategy. This is easily one of the best games that didn't let me down because it's just so consistently high quality from the first hour to the 100th. If you want a game that you can truly live in for a month, this is the one you need to grab. Coming in next, let's have a trip to the forgotten kingdom of Hallowness, because Hollow Knight is the gold standard for a game that just keeps over-delivering. Right from the moment you drop into the damp, eerie well of Dirtmouth, the atmosphere swallows you whole, and it never loosens its grip. You're doing a lot of walking, slashing, and nail-jumping through sprawling caverns, but the genius is in how that simple movement evolves. I mean, you get this pogo ability early on where you bounce off enemies and spikes with your nail, and suddenly every combat encounter also becomes a platforming puzzle. That's the kind of layered design that tells you the developers respected your intelligence from day one. And honestly, the way it handles exploration is a masterclass in tension. You're constantly pushing into the unknown, marking your map with waypoints, hoping you find a bench before you lose all your geo. When you do die, and you will die, the shade mechanic forces you to weigh the risk of rushing back to your corpse versus cutting your losses. That system alone creates those just one more try stakes that kept me glued to the controller for 40 hours. Plus, the world is so tightly interconnected that unlocking a new movement ability like the Mantis Claw for wall jumping essentially opens up 50 new paths you'd forgotten about. It's not just difficult for the sake of it, right? It's difficult because the reward for mastering that combat rhythm is accessing even more secrets. To be fair, I've heard people bounce off the lack of hand-holding, but that's exactly why it belongs here. It trusts you to find your own way. There's a reason it sparked an entire genre of imitators, yet very few capture that same lonely, desperate vibe. So if you've ever wanted a game that respects your time and your skill in equal measure, this is the benchmark. Okay, so next up, this one needs a little context before we get into it because the history here genuinely matters. Cyberpunk 2077 launched in 2020 as maybe the most talked about disaster in modern gaming. And if you were there for it, you already know exactly what that felt like. The promises were enormous, the hype was almost uncomfortable to watch, and then the game shipped in a state that was frankly embarrassing for a studio's reputation. So why is it on this list? Well, because what happened afterward is the reason we're even having this conversation. Over the course of several major updates and then the Phantom Liberty expansion, the team rebuilt this game from the inside out. By the time version 2.0 dropped alongside Phantom Liberty, Cyberpunk 2077 had become something genuinely difficult to put down. The overhauled skill tree actually makes you think about how you want to play instead of just dumping points wherever. The police system finally works, the combat has real weight to it, and Night City stopped feeling like a pretty backdrop and started feeling like a place with logic and life behind it. Phantom Liberty specifically adds a spy thriller storyline set in a new district called Dogtown, and the writing in that expansion is some of the sharpest CD Projekt Red has ever produced. Idris Elba's performance alone carries enough tension to keep you leaning forward through most of it. Honestly, the choices you make in that expansion have consequences that feel genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way, which is exactly what a game set in a world this morally gray should be doing. I mean, most redemption arcs in gaming are about the developer patching bugs and calling it a day. This one was about a studio staring at their failure and refusing to accept it as the final word. That is why Cyberpunk 2077 earns its spot here, because letting you down was its origin story, and not letting you down became its mission. Okay, so next up, Ghost of Tsushima is one of those games you load up expecting to be impressed by how it looks, and then somewhere around hour 5 you realize the visuals are actually the least interesting thing about it. The art direction is extraordinary, you could genuinely spend hours just in photo mode, no exaggeration. But the swordplay is doing something special. The stance system means every enemy type changes how you have to approach the fight, so you are never really on autopilot. It keeps every encounter sharp and intentional, and then the story just quietly starts hitting harder than you expected. Jin is not a loud character, right? He is restrained and composed, but watching him slowly abandon the code he was built around in order to actually save his home is the kind of conflict that lands harder the longer you sit with it. Now, Ghost of Yotei dropped in late 2025, and it is a legitimately great game. Atsu's world is gorgeous. The expanded weapon system gives you more variety than Tsushima's stances ever did, and the revenge narrative is well executed. To be fair, plenty of people prefer Yotei, and I understand that completely. But Atsu's story is essentially one sustained emotional frequency. The revenge mission is clear and consistent, but it does not evolve inward. Jin's story is about a man going to war with his own identity, and that is a fundamentally more interesting kind of tension to follow. I mean, Ghost of Yotei is the more mechanically polished entry, but Ghost of Tsushima is the one that actually stayed with me, and that is why it is here. Coming in next, some games use their mechanics to deliver a story, but Nier Automata uses its mechanics to become the story, and the distance between those two approaches is wider than it might sound. Yoko Taro constructed something here that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and the remarkable thing is that every level reinforces every other. The combat is fluid and satisfying on its own terms. The world is desolate and hauntingly beautiful in ways that feel specific rather than accidental. The story begins as a mission and gradually becomes a meditation on consciousness, grief, purpose, and the particular loneliness of existing without having chosen to. And none of that weight is delivered through exposition alone. It arrives through structure. The genre shifts are the clearest example of this. When the game transitions from third-person action to top-down shooter to bullet hell, it is not demonstrating technical range. It is dismantling your assumptions about what you are playing and by extension about what the characters you are playing as actually are. The soundtrack also operates with the same intention. It is the finest original score in gaming, not because of technical complexity alone, but because it is emotionally synchronized with the game's philosophical arc in a way that feels almost choreographed. Other games have reached for this. Stellar Blade drew from the aesthetic and combat design with real craft, and it is a worthwhile game in its own right. But attempting what Nier Automata does in pieces without the underlying unified vision is what separates everything else from this game. The reason no one has fully replicated it is that it was never assembled from separate ideas. It was conceived as one complete, cohesive question, and every element inside it exists to ask that question in a different way. So next on the list, it's The Last of Us Part 1. This game is one of those games I find myself recommending to people who do not even consider themselves gamers, because the experience it offers does not require any particular fluency with the medium to be genuinely moving. The story is that accessible and that well executed. Joel and Ellie's relationship unfolds with a patience and honesty that feels closer to prestige television writing than to most video game narratives, and the performances match that quality at every step. What I appreciate most about how the gameplay is designed is that it never lets you feel powerful enough to become emotionally detached. Every combat encounter has stakes because your resources are limited and your enemies are unpredictable, and that sustained vulnerability keeps you invested in survival in a way that connects directly to how you feel about the characters. The Part 1 remake brought real improvements to all of this, and I think the facial animation work in particular is worth highlighting because it adds an entire layer of quiet, unspoken storytelling that the original could only approximate. The music score is also something I still return to outside the game, which is probably the most honest thing I can say about how effective it is. It carries the emotional memory of the whole experience inside it. Other narrative-driven games have learned from this one, and some of them have produced genuinely beautiful work. But The Last of Us, Part 1 still sits at the top of that conversation because it never once asked you to meet it halfway. And next up, Baldur's Gate 3 genuinely broke the internet for a while, and the reason is so simple that it almost feels like it should not be remarkable. It just delivered everything it promised, completely and without compromise, in an era where that is rare enough to cause a cultural event. The freedom of choice in this game is on a scale I have not experienced in an RPG before. You can approach almost any situation from multiple, completely different angles, and the world actually responds to each of them with specific, considered outcomes. That kind of systemic depth takes an enormous amount of development effort, and Larian clearly spent it. The turn-based combat should not hook players who do not typically enjoy that format, and yet it absolutely does, because the tactical flexibility and the environmental interactions make every fight feel like a creative sandbox. Every companion is fully voiced and written with genuine specificity, so spending time with them feels like a reward rather than an obligation. And the music adapts dynamically to what you are actually doing in real time, which means the score always feels like yours rather than a generic backdrop. Honestly, the last time a game made this many people simultaneously stop what they were doing to go tell someone else about it, I cannot immediately remember when that was. Baldur's Gate 3 earned every conversation it started, and it earns its spot here because it is precisely the kind of game this list exists to celebrate. Coming in next, following God of War 2018 was always going to be one of the more difficult tasks in recent gaming, not because of the combat or the world building, formidable as those things are, but because of what that game did emotionally. It established a relationship between Kratos and Atreus with enough authenticity and care that players were genuinely invested in where it was going. Ragnarok understood that the weight of that investment was its most valuable asset, and it handled that asset with real respect. The decision to give Atreus his own arc that occasionally works against his father's wishes rather than alongside them was the right one. It introduces a new kind of tension into their dynamic, one built not on external threat but on the particular difficulty of a parent watching a child begin to define themselves independently. That is rich narrative territory, and the game explores it with patience. The combat retains everything that made 2018 feel so satisfying and layers new options and encounters on top of it with enough care that the additions feel like natural growth rather than padding. The 9 realms are individually realized with enough visual and cultural specificity to make exploration feel genuinely rewarding. Christopher Judge's performance is one of the finest in the medium right now, and the specific quality of his restraint, the way Kratos communicates volumes through economy of expression, is what makes the emotional payoffs hit as hard as they do. Now, next up, we have The Witcher 3. Look, The Witcher 3 is one of those games that people who have not played it sometimes assume is overhyped, and then they play it and go quiet for about 2 weeks. The world is not just big, it is genuinely, convincingly alive. Every area has its own character, its own problems, its own social texture, and the writing treats all of that with enough specificity that you stop thinking of it as game content and start thinking of it as a place. The side quests are the real argument for why this game is still being discussed a decade after release. They are not filler. They are complete stories, many of them morally complex in ways that linger with you, and the Bloody Baron storyline in particular is some of the finest writing the RPG genre has ever produced. Geralt is a fantastic protagonist for this kind of world because his outsider status gives every interaction a natural tension. He is useful and unwelcome simultaneously, and the game explores that contradiction with genuine intelligence. The combat gets more heat than it deserves, in my opinion, especially with a strong build, but I will acknowledge it is not the main event here. The main event is the writing, the world, and the music, which sounds like it grew out of the soil of this world rather than being composed for it. The Witcher 3 is on this list because it delivered an experience so complete and so carefully made that it has spent 10 years being the answer to the question of what an open-world RPG should aspire to be. Coming in next, we have Elden Ring. I still remember looking at the pre-release trailers for Elden Ring and feeling that familiar knot in my stomach. It looked incredible, sure, but after years of being burned by overhyped open worlds, I was ready for it to stumble. Then I stepped out of that cave in Limgrave for the first time, saw the tree sentinel on horseback, and realized I was completely, utterly wrong. That moment where you're given absolutely no direction, no waypoint, just a massive world and a tiny horse is when Elden Ring made its promise to me. It said, I trust you to figure it out, and honestly, that respect for the player is why it never let me down. You see something interesting in the distance, a crumbling ruin or a glowing cave, and you just ride toward it. 9 times out of 10, that curiosity is rewarded with something meaningful, whether it's a new weapon, a painful boss fight, or just a vista that makes you stop and stare. The combat, too, forces you to adapt constantly. You can't just rely on the same dodge and slash rhythm from Dark Souls because the enemies are so varied and aggressive. You're jumping over sweeping attacks, summoning spirits to distract giant bears, and mixing sorceries with ashes of war just to survive. That variety keeps the gameplay loop from ever feeling stale even after 100 hours. Plus, the way the map reveals itself to you piece by piece with those little map fragment icons teasing unexplored areas creates a feedback loop that's almost impossible to resist. You tell yourself you're just going to check one more ruin, and then suddenly it's 3 a.m. and you're fighting an ulcerated tree spirit in a poison swamp. And compared to other open worlds that just hand you a checklist, the Lands Between feels like a genuine place to get lost in. And for a game this massive, it would have been so easy for the difficulty to feel unfair or the bosses to feel repetitive, but instead, every death feels like a lesson and every victory feels earned. It didn't just meet the impossible hype, it built a world so deep and mysterious that I'm still, to this day, finding things I missed on my first playthrough. That's not just a game that didn't let me down, that's a game that set a new standard for what the entire genre should aspire to be. And finally, I saved this one for last, and I think if you have spent any time at all in the gaming community over the past several years, some part of you already knew it was coming. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the kind of game that arrives once in a generation, the kind that makes you genuinely reconsider what you expect from this medium, and the kind that people who played it years ago still bring up unprompted because it did something to them that they have not fully finished processing. The detail is the first thing everyone mentions, and it is impossible not to because it is genuinely staggering in its scope and its consistency. The world of this game does not simulate life. It models it, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a stage set and an actual place. But the detail is not the story. The story is Arthur Morgan, and Arthur Morgan is one of the finest protagonists ever written for a video game without any qualification or caveat necessary. He begins as a loyalist, a man defined entirely by his belonging to something larger than himself, and the game walks him slowly and honestly toward a confrontation with everything that belonging has cost him and everyone around him. Now, I do not want to be that kind of guy who spoils you with the best moments in the game, but what I can just say is that the story is great, actually one of my favorites, but also it's totally heart-wrenching, and you should be prepared for the ending. But anyway, aside from the great story, the world has everything you want from a real world. I think this game has the most lived-in video game world among all the other open-world games that I have played. Like, even without you, the world of Red Dead Redemption 2 will still keep going. And that's actually the truth, because after the ending of the game, you can still roam around, explore, and discover new things that you have not found yet. And honestly, that's why it's a must-play. It isn't just a game about the Wild West. It's a simulation of existing within it, with all the beauty, boredom, and brutality that comes with the territory. But those are the games that just meet everything that I want from a video game. There are still lots out there, maybe I didn't know about them, so feel free to leave a comment below. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, click like. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.